We asked Daylan Flowers about the most important Ole Miss defensive line this year. He's coming up next. This is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. I am your host, Stephen Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media with Yahoo Sports and a former Ole Miss staff member. Here in just a second, I'm going to be joined by Daylan Flowers, but I do want to remind everybody to find a second listen on the network. Locked On does a fantastic job. Every pro team and dang near every college team is at your fingertips. It's something you should absolutely check out. Let's bring in Daylan Flowers and talk about a lot of stuff, honestly. Even though it is the end of June and not much is going on, we need to get to media days in about 3 weeks, pretty bad. But this morning I started my top fives, and I started with the defensive line. And just so you know, Daylan, I do not count the jack position as a defensive line. They are counted as linebackers to me. So I only counted a three-man front. And the five that I have for the top defensive lines is number one, Jam Brown. I think Jam Brown is the absolute most important on this team. Number two, Xavion Harris. Number three, Cam Franklin. Number four, William Eccles. And number five, Deshaun Womack. That is my opinion. What say you?
I like your number one. I'll go Jam Brown number one, too. I think he's very important in terms of him, and my number two will be Cam Franklin. I think they're both very important in setting up a lot of foundational success for Suntarine Perkins this year, who has seen a lot of success, but I think within guys around him being successful as well, make him a lot more open to have one-on-one type abilities on the field. So I think I would go those two, my number one and two. I'll go William Eccles number three. I think that he coming into that class being the number one defensive lineman in Mississippi the year that he committed and sitting behind the guys that he did last year. And he's spoken very maturely throughout spring practices and the press conferences that we were able to talk to him. He spoke very maturely, and you could tell this was a guy that had not obviously played a lot at Ole Miss, but it was very seasoned, and I could just tell that he felt ready for the situation. So I think William will be a huge move for Ole Miss, and I think as well that he will surprise a lot of fans by his abilities for his size, because you look at him, you don't think William is as quick as he is with his hands and his feet, but he's a really quick guy for his size. So I think I'm going to go William Eccles number three, and I'll put Cam Franklin at number four. Obviously a lot of hype around him as well, and I think that's another guy that has superstar abilities for Pete Golding and Ole Miss, and it's just all going to obviously have to see if it comes together on the field, but I think Cam can really be a really great 1-2 punch for Ole Miss with William Eccles. And number five, honestly, I always feel like when you're doing some type of list of top three, top five, that final spot is always kind of the hardest one to kind of put into. I don't know. There's a plethora of guys that I think that can go into where I would go into the last spot. I think a lot of different guys bring a lot of different values to the team. I don't know if Cam Clark counts, but I may go Cam Clark. I know, again, he has not been seen much for Ole Miss yet, but I think Cam Clark may be really important for Ole Miss. He looked really good in the spring practices. I was able to cover the running backs and the defensive line throughout spring practices. He looked really good. So I think he may be a surprise for Ole Miss fans. Cam Clark isn't just a standout name that people were thinking about at the top of their head, but in terms of what I've seen so far over spring and things that I've heard, I think Cam Clark may really be important for Ole Miss in the fall.
Speaking of what you saw and what you heard, do you think Andrew Maddox will be on the field in the fall?
It's a great question, my friend. I hope so. I think that the developmental phase of where he's gone from is really important. I don't know. It was kind of a moment where we were all excited to see him maybe get a chance this year finally, and then it kind of happens with him going out with the injury. I don't know. I think that he's progressed a lot quicker than he was supposed to at this point in time. I don't know exactly where he is in terms of where his injury is at, but I think that he may get that opportunity. And I think that he's a guy that a lot of people were kind of standing out as last year, where was he still going to be here? Was he still going to be competing for the quarterback spot? I think that he will be. I just don't know in terms of timetable what his injury is going to be looking like. But I think he still has a really great ability to do something really well here if given the opportunity, obviously, at Ole Miss.
From the practices that you saw this fall or the spring, who is backing up Xavier Harris?
That's a guy that I should have put in my top 5 now that I think about it. And I'll replace, I said my number 5 with Cam Clark. I'll put Xavier 5 and number 5. I completely forgot about Zay. There's a plethora of guys that they were trying out at that position that I don't think at the time they really had solidified. There were a lot of different guys that were moving in and out. But I will also say this as well. We weren't really given a true glimpse of full action of the defensive line throughout spring practices. They were really kind of going 50%. So I can't give you a clear answer on that. They were trying a lot of different guys. I think that's going to be the asterisk next to the Pete Golding defense this year. There was so much that was lost from 2024 that they replaced so many players from the defensive line to the linebacking room and, of course, to the secondary room as well. But I think there's a lot of young guys there. It's just how much experience they're going to have in these big moments, because one of my biggest things for Ole Miss this year, Stephen, is they face a lot of great quarterbacks throughout the 2025 season. So they're going to be tested in terms of the quarterback experience, the way these quarterbacks move within the pocket and outside the pocket. So I think there's a plethora of guys that have the opportunity to back up Xavier Harris. I don't know exactly who is going to be it because there were a lot of different guys that were kind of put out there in those positions in spring.
And with the questions surrounding the Ole Miss secondary, and we'll do the top 5 on them a little bit later on, but with that, the best way to handle that is through a pass rush. And that's Suntaryn Perkins, that is Prince Will, Amami Ellen, those guys on the outside. Is there anybody that we're not thinking of in the pass rush that could be a very big benefit for this Ole Miss Rebel team?
Great question, man. I honestly think Prince Well. I think that people getting off of his name, obviously from Prince Imamian last year, were really excited, but he really wasn't able to put too much together, at Nebraska. And I think that he's a good get in terms of his size for facing SEC teams this year. I think he's a really well-built defensive lineman for Ole Miss. I think that placing him on the outside will be really beneficial because a lot of times Ole Miss plays the type of styles where they're only rush 3, and we saw that a lot more last year because of the abilities that the defensive linemen had to not need to rush 4. And you kind of sit back in coverage a lot of times and do a lot of different things. But I think he has abilities to get into the inside of the offensive lineman and really make some plays happen. I think his ability with his feet to move and kind of confuse offensive linemen is really good. He looked like a guy that, again, they weren't really going 100%, but his intangibles look really, really well. So I'm excited to see what he's going to look like this offseason.
All right, when we come back, we'll talk to Daylan all about the Ole Miss basketball team and the SEC schedule that has came out. Plus, we have some random thoughts that we're going to talk about in just a second, so stick around. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. Listen, you're already following the action. Why not make it just a little bit more thrilling? With the FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and it makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events, which I think that's the reason we should be 4-4-2-2-1-1, but we'll talk about that later. Whether or not I'm placing a same-game parlay or watching the bet ride into the 9th inning, FanDuel makes it feel like I'm part of the action. Right now, Ole Miss is sitting at about a 37.5-point favorite to open the season against Georgia State. Maybe that is your flavor. And if you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. Open up the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, Daylan Flowers in the house. And listen, the SEC schedule got announced last week. And honestly, Chris Beard was on my show, and I wanted to ask him about it, but I kind of went down the analytic rabbit hole with him a little bit. So I didn't get to ask Chris Beard about the SEC basketball schedule, and I am kind of sorry about that. But I did get an answer about a mid-range jumper, but that I digress about that. Ole Miss in the SEC in 2025, 2026, they are going to face Mississippi State as a home and home, Auburn as a home and home, and Vanderbilt as a home and home. Not LSU. LSU is off the table. I don't know how I feel about that, Daylan.
I don't either. I think that LSU has kind of slacked in terms of basketball progression over the last few years, but that Ole Miss LSU basketball game has always been a fun little rivalry, especially this past year. We saw LSU give some fight to the Rebels this year, and I think that that's a turn for the table and just hope for where LSU fans have in terms of where their basketball program is going. But I think that LSU and Ole Miss have a pretty deep rivalry in terms of all sports. LSU and Ole Miss fans seemingly have been going back and forth over the last few years in terms of just the athletic growth of both programs. So it's kind of sad not to see LSU on that schedule in terms of going home and away. We are, they'll see LSU at home this year, obviously, but not going down to Baton Rouge. And I think Baton Rouge is also one of the more underrated kind of venues in the SEC basketball as well, too. I think when they're winning and when their fans are invested in their program, they have a really good atmosphere for basketball for the SEC.
Yeah, non-conference this year has a chance to be very sneaky awesome for Ole Miss basketball fans. A road game at Madison Square Garden against St. John's. There's a rumor that popped up, I guess it was Jeff Goodman today, about NC State in a Christmas time neutral site game.
Yeah.
South Haven is the likely spot for next year, but this year it's in Greensboro, North Carolina. The ACC rival is Miami. And everybody's going to say, well, Miami was terrible this year. Well, Miami just got a Duke assistant coach and hit the transfer portal hard. So what you saw last year is not what you're going to see this year.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I think it's huge to get great non-conference games in. I think it matters in terms of the resume when you get ready to go into March. And maybe you didn't have the greatest, conference player. Maybe you had a okay conference season, but you wanted to kind of maybe do deep runs in the SEC tournament to solidify yourself in March Madness, but you weren't able to do that. I think those non-conference games are huge in the beginning part of the season. It testifies who your team can be in terms of facing adversity and roadside activity, but I think it's going to be huge for this Ole Miss team this year. They lost a lot of veteran leadership after the 2025 season, and I think a lot of these guys are expected to do really good things. Chris Beard hit the transfer portal a little bit late that I think people wanted to, but he's gotten some really great acquirements from the transfer portal guys that fit his playmaking style. Veteran guys that can play in the front court really well and give some Ole Miss that rebounding ability that they kind of lacked in 2024, 2025. So I think getting these guys in moments against great teams, even on the road for a few of these games in neutral sites, are going to be huge for Ole Miss in the later parts of the season, because we saw this past year that the SEC is no slouch, and it's going to be like this. It's going to be the same way in 2025, 2026. So the SEC is going to be battle tested once again for Ole Miss, but playing some of these games like St. John's, like, NC State, plethora other teams like Miami, as you mentioned as well, are going to be huge for Ole Miss, because moving forward, those are going to be some of the teams that you're probably going to see in March Madness. So getting adapted to those different type of play styles and those different type of players from other conferences are huge for Ole Miss.
Yeah, this is going to be overall a pretty difficult schedule, more so than a year ago. But this is probably going to be Chris Beard's best basketball team. As you've seen, basically players, it's starting to look like a real Chris Beard basketball team.
Yeah, and that obviously comes with excitement from the year before, but Chris Beard knew exactly what he wanted to do in the transfer portal. I think that he had the objectives that were kind of solidified as soon as the season ended, because he understood the totality of what was going to be lost from this past year's team. And understanding what you needed immediately is huge for Ole Miss, because you don't know what you're going to be able to get sometimes when you're at Ole Miss. But Chris Beard has developed quickly that he is a winner. And when he first got here, he was able to hit the portal really hard. So I wasn't really doubting what he was going to be able to do. It was just kind of when and how. And the players that he's been able to bring in really bring excitement to the Ole Miss basketball fandom. I think fans are really now excited moving forward about what Chris Beard and his staff can produce. they have the ability to be in March Madness consistently and make deep runs and compete with any of the best teams in the conference this year. I know there were some of those swing games for Ole Miss in the regular season and in the SEC tournament where, we're looking at guys that maybe we should have competed a little bit harder with, but I was just really satisfied that the way that Ole Miss grew in only 2 years under Chris Beard and were able to compete with Auburn consistently. They were able to compete with other teams in the conference that really show potential to be really good. You remember Ole Miss dominated Alabama and Tuscaloosa early part in the conference schedule as well. So Ole Miss has the ability to do the same thing in 2025 and 2026, and it's all going to come to the floor. Just understanding how great Chris Beard really is. I thought your interview with him was perfect and fantastic. He said something that stuck out where he was saying that he doesn't really like changing players' game. He just like developing what these players are good at. And from seeing so many of the transfer portal guys, I'm excited about what Chris Beard is going to be able to develop about how good some of these guys are and what they do on the court.
All right, when we come back, we're going to get off topic just a little bit, probably even talk about the controversy that was the College World Series. So stick around. All right, we're back. It's late June. The College World Series is over. And Daylan, I'm gonna say this right now.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that people are upset that the coaches got ejected for Coastal Carolina. I understand that they didn't want that to happen. But I also want people to understand that the umpire was completely justified in doing it. Yeah. And also, the moment he walked out of that dugout, this became a possible scenario. So I put out a short a little bit earlier in the day, and the coach from Coastal Carolina did the exact thing that he gets onto his players for doing. He was the one that put the team at risk. Now, I don't think that Coastal was going to win that game regardless. I mean, LSU was going to win that game. But Coastal's manager, head coach, getting kicked out in the first inning, it was completely deserved. Every level of baseball, when you argue balls and strikes, they warn you. And then if you keep doing it, they run you.
You're right, man. And I was really evident about that myself, and I saw you kind of going back and forth with some people on Twitter, but I hate that it happens. It kind of takes away from the moment of being the College World Series finals and, the best two teams in there going head to head. And now the first base coach and the head coach are now out of the game for Coastal Carolina. I don't think they would have still end up winning this series regardless, but it kind of, it takes a lot of the feel away from the game. But, he knew what he was doing. And, you whether you agree or disagree with some of the calls that were happening on the field at that time, you got to be more restrained to kind of hold yourself together and know and understand what the circumstances is and what the moment is. You only get those opportunities in your career maybe once in a lifetime, and you don't know if you're ever going to get back to a national championship game. And so, I hate it for that it happened. I hate it for Coastal Carolina. I hate it for the game of baseball. But when you go out there and you get in the face of the umpires and you're screaming like that, and who knows what was actually said to the umpires? Well, it happens. It doesn't just happen at college. It happens in the MLB all the time. Then the umpires, do a little bit of mishappening things in terms of calling strikes and balls, and the managers get a little bit hot. They go out there, and 9 times out of 10 they're going to get ejected, and that's just part of the game. And unfortunately, this happened to be game 2 of the College World Series finals, and this Camden to be to a Coastal Carolina who really needed their manager out there at the time. But it's unfortunate that it happened. But I honestly, he knew what he was doing. He knew the moment and how hot that he really was, and he had to control those emotions. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to, and he got kicked out because of it. And it kind of mixes an emotion that a lot of people say it was early in the game, et cetera, et cetera. It could have happened in the first inning, the 5th inning. It doesn't matter. He was going to get tossed no matter what. So it sucks, but it was he had it coming, unfortunately, for him.
Yeah, if this game happened in February, if it was a February game, he would have been thrown out and nobody would have been surprised.
Yeah.
The only reason they were surprised and they were upset about it is because of it being a championship series, which I can't stand personally, that somebody wants the umpires to act differently just because of what the game is called and what's going on. I prefer consistency in February, the same game in February called in the College World Series. That is the baseball that I want to see. And it's just that it's not, hey, we need to let them get away with stuff. We need to do this. And I think that the manager for Coastal Carolina, he was banking on the fact that he could get away with it because of the game. So he probably ramped it up a little bit more, and he didn't do his homework with who was behind the plate, because that dude, he's never been somebody that's had a slow trigger about removing managers.
Yeah, I love your point. I have referee experience in basketball, and I kind of get a little bit disheartened when people say, "Oh, this is the finals," or "This is the the national championship game, so this shouldn't be called." Like I had to say, like, guys, a foul is a foul no matter what, or a tech is a tech, or a travel is a travel. It doesn't matter if this is the national championship game or just the regular season game in December. The consistency has to be there, and it goes for any sport as well. Some people may get upset if you're a soccer fan, you see a yellow card in the first 2 minutes. The consistency has to be there no matter what, and that's the umpires, the referee's job to do, and that's their control their game and do what they think is correct. And the umpire did what he thought it was correct. At the end of the day, like you just said, if this was happening in January, he would have got it thrown out and no one would have cared. But since this was the moment of the national championship game, game 2 with Coastal Carolina already down 1-0, people saw that and kind of took it as a little bit of soft. But the umpire had to do what he thought was best for that moment and what was correct, and he did exactly that. So can't be too upset with him.
Yeah, and this is the same person that came out during the early part of the College World Series about the correct pronunciation of Chanticleer. And whenever you have that reputation, the umpires knew. The umpires have scouting reports too. Yeah. They know who is mouthy and what's going on, and he probably had a little bit less rope. So it just is what it is. Daylan, what do you got going on at the Rebel Walk, bud?
Just riding, hopefully getting back to Oxford a few more weeks. Within the next week or two, I should be back. So getting ready to try to cover some summer ball for the Ole Miss football team and get a little bit more in-depth interviews with some players. Just released an interview with KK Deans on my show and got confirmed for the first week of July. Keith Carter will be on, so we'll have a chance to sit down and talk to him about a few different things. So super, super excited to chat with Keith for a little bit and talk about who he is a little bit more as a person, and as well kind of go over some things, Ole Miss athletics, because I'm sure people are dying to hear from Keith and understand what he's going through and behind closed doors within everything. So super excited about that. But it's a fun time right now. I know too much isn't going on, so it's a little bit hard to do things as a journalist, but it's still fun to be able to, speak with Keith. And I'm working on a few other athletes around Ole Miss as well to kind of just sit down and chat with. So I'm super fun, man.
All right, Daylan Flowers from the Rebel Walk and the Daylan Show podcast. Check him out wherever you get your podcast. Thank you very much, buddy, and we'll talk to you next week, man.
Thank you, man. Take care. Hotty toddy.
Hotty toddy. All right, thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, and that is why we are the dominant podcast around Ole Miss sports. And if you don't believe us, just search Ole Miss podcast online and see exactly what comes up. Don't forget to check out a second listen on the network. Brian Smith and his Portal podcast is out there, and he can help you be the most informed fan in college football. Get that podcast wherever you listen to the podcast or on YouTube. That would be pretty awesome. It's also on the Tegna brand, but we'll get to that in a little while. So we'll see what's up there. Remember, hotty toddy, everyone, and analytics is just the old English word that means bad football. We'll see you later.